What more do we know about this Nvidia announcement and what it tells us about the Trump administration's thinking on export controls?
Well, I think it's interesting that it was Nvidia who announced this, not the White House. I'll get to that and what that means in a little bit. But essentially, this is a great victory for CEO of Nvidia, Jensen Huang, who, by the way, is in Beijing right now, just appeared on state television. And we learned of this development on the H20 chip through a blog post from Nvidia, essentially saying that they've been given tacit approval by the White House to apply for those export licenses for the H20 chips to be sold to China. And he expects, Jensen Huang and Nvidia all expect that those license applications to be approved and the H20 chips can resume being sold to China. Jensen Huang has been an outspoken critic of these export controls from the United States, saying they haven't worked, and also they've given competitors in China like Huawei an unfair advantage. In fact, Nvidia projected they could lose about $8 billion in sales in this current quarter just because of those export controls. They'd also been working on a new chip based on Blackwell architecture to comply with those Trump trade curbs. But now, if the H20 is going to resume sales to China, it would be an interesting development, obviously, and a very fortuitous one for Nvidia to have two potential chips. Yes, they're scaled back from the most advanced AI chips from Nvidia, but still, having chips that are compliant with U.S. export controls allowed to go into China is a big development, not only for Nvidia, but for U.S.-China relations, no doubt.
Well, on that point, Stephen, what is your assessment of what this tells us about those conversations, the trade tensions that we know exist between the two sides, that on some level have eased to some extent? What does this reflect when it comes to those trade negotiations?
Well, it tells us a lot about what Jensen Huang and Donald Trump spoke about in the White House last week, and also why Jensen Huang is in Beijing right now with meetings with the Commerce Minister as well as their trade negotiator, He Lifeng. So obviously he's the one that has lobbied the White House, gaining that approval for the export licenses, and he's the one to take that message essentially to China. What it tells me about the backroom bargaining in the trade deal and the trade truce that was reaffirmed in London is that the United States clearly wants China to speed up its export licensing process for rare earth minerals as well as rare earth magnets. And what does China want? They want a relaxation of those tight export controls on advanced chips. It seems as though this was win-win for the two countries as they try and bridge their differences. And this was maybe for Donald Trump, as he met with Jensen Huang, a little bit of a low-hanging fruit and was convinced that they're doing the United States tech companies' competitive advantage more harm than good.
After obtaining Washington's guarantees that such shipments would be authorized, Nvidia intends to resume selling its H20 AI processor in China. This is a significant shift from the Trump administration's previous position on policies intended to curtail Beijing's AI aspirations. In an interview on Monday, Nvidia stated that U.S. government officials had informed the company that they would approve export licenses for the H20 artificial intelligence accelerator. This action could boost Nvidia's earnings by billions this year and allow it to fulfill orders that it had previously written off as lost because of government restrictions. In order to comply with Washington's prior trade restrictions on China, which Trump's administration strengthened in April to prevent H20 sales to the Asian nation without a U.S. authorization, Nvidia built the less sophisticated H20 chip. In pre-market U.S. trade, Nvidia's stock increased by up to 4.5%. Shortly after Nvidia made the announcement, CEO Jensen Huang, who met with President Donald Trump last week and is currently in Beijing for a government-sponsored conference, said the company had obtained authorization to start shipping on Chinese state broadcaster CCTV. A request for comment on whether the Commerce Department, which is in charge of U.S. export regulations on chips and the equipment used to produce them, had previously granted any H20 permits was not immediately answered. Following weeks of improving relations between Washington and Beijing under the aegis of an ambiguous trade truce intended to see both parties authorize exports of vital technologies, the U.S. move comes. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that there is a strong desire on both sides for Trump and President Xi Jinping to meet later this year after meeting with his Chinese counterpart last week. A series of export restrictions, including those on chip design software, that were put in place prior to last month's trade negotiations in London, have been loosened by Washington in recent weeks. This is in exchange for China permitting increased sales of rare earth materials used to produce various high-tech goods, something U.S. officials believe they had accomplished during negotiations in Geneva the previous month. Trump's team maintained that Nvidia's H20 chip regulations were not negotiable during and after those talks. Huang, who has called U.S. chip limitations a failure that contributed to Huawei Technologies Co. becoming Nvidia's leading Chinese rival, has won a huge victory with the about-face. H20 shipments would also benefit businesses like DeepSeek and Alibaba Group holding looted, that, in spite of Huawei's advancements in semiconductors, look to Nvidia hardware to develop, scale, and run the AI services they're creating in order to compete with OpenAI and others. Following Nvidia's statement, Nasdaq futures jumped, and Chinese markets also had a strong response. On Tuesday, the Hang Seng Tech Index increased by 2.2%, Alibaba's shares in Hong Kong increased by 6%, and data center providers such as Beijing Sinet Technology Co. saw an 8.4% increase. So, what implications does this have for Nvidia's stock? Let's explore that. But first, a big thank you to those of you who've stuck with us this far. Creating these videos takes significant effort and dedication, so if you're enjoying the content, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts on Nvidia stock in the comments. Your support truly helps us grow. Now, let's get back to the video. According to Wei Cern Ling, managing director at Union Bancaire Privée, Nvidia's decision to resume selling H20 to China is undoubtedly a good thing, not only for the business, but also for China tech platforms developing AI capabilities and the supply chain for AI semiconductors. Additionally, this is a positive development for U.S.-China ties. In 2022, the U.S. imposed broad restrictions on Nvidia's sales in China in an effort to deny the Asian nation access to cutting-edge AI that would be useful to the Chinese military. Nvidia has repeatedly created new chips for the Chinese market in order to adhere to those regulations, which have turned into a major source of contention between Beijing and Washington. Months after the first restrictions, the chipmaker unveiled the H800, which was essentially prohibited from being sold to China in 2023 by President Joe Biden's administration. In response, Nvidia released the H20, for which Biden officials considered export restrictions but decided against them. Nvidia created the RTX Pro, another device with a China focus, after Trump advanced H20 controls in April. According to the corporation, the chip is fully compliant, which means it doesn't meet the technical requirements that Washington would need to approve for shipment to the second-largest economy in the world. When asked about Nvidia during a routine briefing, Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman Lin Jian emphasized that China does not support the politicization and weaponization of trade and technology concerns. Export restrictions will not benefit anyone and will cause instability in global industrial supply chains. The potential approval of Nvidia's H20 exports to China by U.S. authorities reopens a crucial sales channel for the American chipmaker. A significant amount of the $15 billion in fiscal 2026 data center revenue that was previously in jeopardy, including the $4 or $5 billion that was initially anticipated in the second half and a portion of the $8 billion in unshipped orders from the second quarter, could be recovered with the reversal. As the first business to reach $4 trillion in market value last week, Nvidia's pivotal role in supplying the hardware for a post-ChatGPT AI infrastructure building boom is demonstrated by the back and forth, which highlights the significance of the China market. Nvidia's pivotal role in the worldwide AI rollout is probably on Huang's agenda as he seeks talks with Chinese policymakers, notably the trade minister. Additionally, Huang has been more outspoken in Washington. He previously stated that since Beijing cannot rely on something that Washington may limit at any time, policymakers don't need to be concerned about the Chinese military utilizing Nvidia chips, which is one of the main arguments for U.S. restrictions. He has also cautioned that Huawei, the hardware behemoth based in Shenzhen that is at the core of Beijing's digital aspirations, will gain a direct advantage from Nvidia's decline in market share in the Asian nation, which Huang stated in May was from 95% to 50%. However, the tech chief appeared to be fighting a lost battle for months. Even though some Trump administration officials are eager to increase Nvidia's sales in regions like the Middle East, they resisted China's restrictions. Sriram Krishnan, the White House's senior AI policy advisor, stated in May that, "We obviously have huge respect for Jensen. However, once these GPUs are physically inside China, there is still widespread and nonpartisan concern about what can happen to them," according to Krishnan. White House National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett stated that Washington's readiness to relax certain export restrictions relating to chips did not apply to the H-20 measures during U.S.-China trade talks in London the following month. At the time, he told CNBC, "I'm not talking about the very, very high-end Nvidia stuff." Later that week, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent reiterated that point to lawmakers, stating that there is no exchange for rare earth chips. Bessent did not, however, rule out a potential loosening on cutting-edge chips and production equipment when MPs questioned him on specific semiconductor restrictions that might be discussed. Bessent stated during congressional testimony in June that there is no intention to expand China's access to cutting-edge American chips. Actually, we have taken the exact opposite action. The Nvidia H20, which is, in my opinion, a very high-end chip but not the most expensive, was subject to export limits. With help from Alan Wan, Cindy Wang, Debbie Wu, Meg Shen, and Winnie Xu. Don't forget to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your input helps create a more knowledgeable community where we can all learn and grow together in the world of investing. Stay up to date with the latest market trends, insights, and key updates by subscribing to Investing Tutorial. We're here to help you make smarter investment decisions and stay ahead of the curve.
And you think that I don't know, is he the Derek Rodman here?
Well, he just met with President Trump a couple days ago. Obviously, Jensen Huang goes to China a lot. He talks about China a lot. But in this case, the meeting with Trump, I think, is specially timed. In other words, it wasn't long scheduled. It isn't a normal thing like his trips to China. So I think it's very likely he has a message. And the message may not be very long or very detailed. And if not a message, then he'll represent Trump's attitude when he met with him. Because I don't think, Jensen Huang came in to see the president and didn't talk about China.
You think, in other words, he's a go-between between the two leaders?
Yeah, I don't want to exaggerate as if, he's the key figure in U.S.-China relations. I just think when somebody is heavily involved in the U.S.-China commercial relationship, as Nvidia is, and he's the CEO, and he travels to China all the time, and is, as said, a rock star in the United States, you don't meet with a president right before you go to China and not carry some information with you. I just think that's very normal.
What do you think is the right approach the U.S. should take with Nvidia? Should it be do everything to constrain their leading-edge technology from being deployed in China for as long as possible, even if that amounts to an 8-month delay or Huawei leapfrogs? Or should it be give them market access, the best companies will always win, we will always have the best companies, and so forth?
Well, it's certainly not the second one, because the best companies don't always win. The companies that have massive state backing and steal IP or acquire IP in various ways often win, and that is, in fact, the Chinese strategy. I guarantee you that if you were speaking candidly in private, Jensen Huang would say, of course the Chinese are targeting Nvidia. Not next year. They're not going to drive Nvidia out of business next year, but in the next 5 or 10 years, they will target Nvidia, and it isn't a function of the best company. It's a function of who has competitive advantages either on their own or, in the Chinese case, often provided by the government. So, letting the market run free, that's not what happens. It's not what China does in technology or anywhere else. And so that's a very optimistic view of what will happen with Nvidia and with chips 5 years down the road.
What about the view on tariffs more broadly with China? We're kind of in this moment of pause. How would you describe the current status quo, and what are the risks as we approach August?
Well, we don't see any sign on the U.S. side that we're going to raise tariffs in August. We already have top level. It doesn't apply to all goods. There are major exceptions, but we have top level 55% tariffs on China, the 30% added in this administration and the 25% started in the Trump administration. I could see those just staying where they are. Yes, President Trump could get angry. He seems to have gotten angry at a lot of our trade partners, but there's no sign he's getting angry at China. There's no complaints about magnets. There's a lot of stories about the U.S. trying to organize a trip to Beijing. So I think the outcome on August 12th is probably we'll stay where we are.
Yeah. And